The hammer struck wood again and again. Each sound echoed through the hollow barn, sharp against the wind that moved across the Kentucky fields. Victor Lane was finishing the final panel of a stall door, his gloves marked with dust and pine splinters. His pickup truck sat outside, engine humming softly, radio playing low through the open window. He was alone. The sun hung low, washing the fields in dull gold. Inside the barn, sawdust drifted in the air like slow rain. A thermos sat on the workbench beside a half-eaten sandwich, the coffee inside still warm. By 5:30, the temperature had dropped. Victor had promised to stop by the hardware store before closing, but he never arrived. The shop owner waited, then locked the doors, assuming he had changed his mind. On the quiet farm road, the only movement was the slow rotation of the barn's weather vane. An hour later, a passing farmer noticed something strange. Victor's truck was still there, engine running, headlights dim in the gathering dark. The driver's door stood open. No sign of Victor. The man called the sheriff's office. Within minutes, 2 deputies arrived, their flashlights slicing through the dusk. Inside, the barn was silent except for the ticking of the idling engine outside. Victor's workbench was untouched, his tools neatly arranged except for one hammer lying near the ground. The nails he had been using were spilled across the dirt floor, as if something had interrupted him mid-task. They found his thermos, still half full. His lunchbox unopened. The hammer's handle showed fresh fingerprints. The deputies searched the surrounding field, calling his name into the wind. Nothing. The next morning, search teams combed through the woods that bordered the property. Dogs followed a scent trail that led behind the barn and vanished near a fence line. Tire tracks cut into the mud, too faded to match. By noon, Sheriff Tom Hensley arrived on scene. He examined the area in silence, his eyes tracing the scuffed ground near the doorway. Something had happened here, and it had happened fast. Reporters gathered by the road as the search widened. Neighbors described Victor as steady, careful, the kind of man who never left a job unfinished. None could imagine him walking away without a word. By evening, the engine of his truck finally sputtered out. The barn stood quiet again, doors swinging slightly in the wind. Victor Lane was officially listed as missing. In the sheriff's report, the final entry for that day was brief. Truck found running. Tools left behind. No sign of struggle. Subject presumed missing. But one detail lingered. A faint trail of disturbed dirt leading toward the trees, half covered by fallen leaves. It was small, easily overlooked. The deputies marked it for follow-up in the morning. They did not know that by then, the rain would come. And with it, the first traces of what truly happened to Victor Lane would begin to disappear. Victor Lane was 38 years old, a carpenter by trade and a man of steady hands. In Milford County, almost everyone knew his name. He built the porches people stood on every summer, the fences that lined their farms, the barns that still carried his careful touch years later. His work spoke for him. Clean, simple, dependable. He lived alone in a small house near the county road, the same place he had shared with his wife before she passed away. After her death, he never remarried. He filled his days with work, volunteering at the church on weekends, helping with repairs after storms, always the first to lend his tools and the last to ask for anything in return. Victor's life was quiet, almost predictable. He rose early, worked long hours, and stopped by the same diner for coffee every morning. Locals described him as kind, soft-spoken, the type who listened more than he talked. He kept his truck spotless and his workshop organized with a precision that bordered on ritual. Those who knew him best said he found comfort in routine. But even in the calmest life, small tensions can build unseen. Just beyond his property lived Harold Denton, a farmer in his early 40s. The two men had once been friendly, occasionally sharing equipment or lending a hand during harvest season. Over time, that changed. It started with a fence line, a stretch of land both men claimed belonged to their property. Survey records were old, boundaries unclear. The disagreement never turned violent, but words were exchanged, tempers rose, and by the spring of 1986, they were no longer on speaking terms. Neighbors said it was nothing serious, just the kind of rural dispute that came and went. Yet it left a quiet bitterness hanging between them. Victor tried to stay out of trouble. He took on extra work, restoring barns and sheds around the county. The project he was working, on the day he vanished, had been one of his biggest contracts. A full barn reconstruction for a property not far from Denton's land. His reputation made the news of his disappearance hard to accept. People could not believe that a man so rooted in the community, so steady in his habits, could simply vanish. The church held vigils. The diner where he once sat every morning left his usual seat empty for weeks. Sheriff Tom Hensley spoke with everyone who knew him, but no one had seen or heard from Victor after that Friday afternoon. Not a phone call, not a sighting, nothing. Still, something in his background drew the sheriff's attention. That lingering dispute with Denton, that unspoken tension over the land they both claimed. It was too minor to be motive, yet too real to ignore. In small towns, people disappear for many reasons, some by choice, others not at all. But as the days passed and the evidence from Victor's workshop began to surface, it became clear that his calm, ordinary life had ended in anything but an ordinary way. 2 days after Victor Lane vanished, the rain eased and the ground began to dry. The search teams returned to the barn, hoping the weather had spared some trace of where he went. Sheriff Tom Hensley stood by the doorway, watching deputies mark sections of the dirt floor with numbered flags. The morning was silent, except for the hum of flies and the rustle of wet grass in the wind. Near the back door, a deputy noticed a faint dark stain beneath the layer of sawdust. When the dust was brushed away, the ground showed a patch of dried blood soaked into the earth. A second stain followed, smaller but visible, leading toward the outer wall. The officers paused. What had begun as a missing person search was starting to look different. They called for the crime scene photographer. Measurements were taken, samples collected. The rain had washed away much, but not everything. Behind the barn, the mud told a clearer story. Long, uneven marks dragged through the soil toward the tree line. The pattern was erratic, heavy at first, then lighter, as if whatever made them had been lifted or carried. Sheriff Hensley followed the trail to where it ended at a patch of broken weeds. Beyond that, the ground turned rocky, impossible to track. The dogs caught a brief scent, circled twice, and lost it near the woods. No footprints remained. Back inside the barn, investigators catalogued every item in sight. The hammer Victor had been using lay under the workbench, handle slick with rain and dust. Nails were scattered as if knocked over mid-strike. One plank of wood bore a fresh dent, a small splash of blood just beside it. Then came the find that shifted everything. Under a pile of sawdust near the far wall, a deputy uncovered a wristwatch. The face was cracked, the band torn. It had stopped at exactly 6:47 p.m. Engraved on the back were the initials VL, Victor Lane. The object was bagged, photographed, and logged as potential evidence. Around it, investigators found faint smears of blood matching the earlier stains. The medical examiner later confirmed it was human. As the evidence accumulated, the tone of the investigation changed. The sheriff called off the civilian search parties and restricted access to the site. The barn, once just a workplace, was now a potential crime scene. Deputies sealed the doors and posted guards overnight. Reporters began to gather outside the property, asking questions the sheriff could not answer. Was Victor alive? Had someone taken him? Why was there blood but no body? Each question hung unanswered as the sun dropped behind the fields. Inside the sheriff's office, the team reviewed everything collected from the scene. The drag marks, the blood, the broken watch. It told a partial story. A man working alone, interrupted suddenly, struck or injured, then moved by someone strong enough to carry him away. The rain that followed his disappearance had destroyed most of what might have remained. But small details survived. A bent nail, a streak of oil near the barn door, tire impressions faint but visible along the back road. They were too distorted for a match, yet one pattern stood out. The tires appeared narrow, from an older truck model. Only a few people in the area still owned vehicles that fit that description. When the deputies checked the registration records, one name appeared on the list: Harold Denton. The sheriff did not speak for a long time after reading it. He knew the history between Denton and Victor, The fence line argument, the quiet hostility that neighbors whispered about. It had always seemed harmless until now. That evening, as the last of the evidence was sealed and stored, Hensley made a single note in his case log. Blood confirmed. Watch recovered. Drag pattern to woods. Denton to be questioned. The search for Victor Lane had ended. The search for his killer had just begun. The morning after the blood was found, Sheriff Tom Hensley began what would become one of the longest investigations of his career. He arrived at the station before sunrise, his desk already crowded with evidence bags, photographs, and half-written reports. The county's resources were thin: 3 deputies, 1 crime scene technician, and a state lab nearly 2 hours away. But the pressure to find Victor Lane was growing by the hour. The first step was to speak to everyone who had seen Victor on his last day. Hensley and Deputy Cole started with the property owner who had hired him for the barn restoration. The man repeated the same story he had told before. Victor arrived early, worked through the afternoon, and seemed in good spirits. Nothing unusual. No visitors. No argument. Next came the neighbors. Most said they saw Victor's truck parked near the barn that evening, engine running, headlights on. One farmer claimed he heard raised voices, but the wind had been too strong to make out words. Another swore he saw a second vehicle parked near the road, an older model truck, light blue or gray. It did not take long for one name to surface again and again: Harold Denton. Hensley knew Denton well enough. A hard, quiet man, 42 years old, who owned land bordering the property where Victor had been working. Denton had been in disputes with more than one neighbor over boundaries and contracts. He was known for keeping to himself, but his temper was quick when challenged. When the sheriff and his deputy arrived at Denton's farmhouse, they found him outside repairing a fence post. He did not seem surprised to see them. His answers were calm, practiced. He said he had seen Victor that afternoon, driving away around sunset. He claimed he waved, but Victor did not wave back. He insisted he had nothing to do with the disappearance. Inside Denton's barn, Hensley noticed a few things: a shovel recently cleaned, boots caked with dried mud, and a faint smell of oil that matched the residue found near Victor's barn door. Still, there was nothing concrete, nothing that could justify an arrest. The forensic team processed both barns for prints. The results were incomplete: partial smudges on a tool handle, faint impressions on Victor's thermos, none clear enough for identification. Blood samples were sent to the state lab, but this was 1986. DNA analysis was not yet available. The only tests possible were basic type matching, and the results confirmed what they already knew. The blood was human, likely Victor's, but that was all. Days turned into weeks. Volunteers searched the nearby woods, creeks, and abandoned wells. Church members organized search parties every Sunday after service, covering new areas each time. They found nothing. The fields were wide, the land unforgiving, and the rain had erased much of what could have been evidence. In town, speculation grew. Some whispered that Victor had owed someone money. Others said the argument with Denton had turned violent. There were even rumors that Victor had planned to leave Milford County, tired of small-town life. None of it fit. Victor's bank records showed no sign of debt. His tools, truck, and unfinished projects all pointed to a man planning for the next day, not running from it. Reporters from the local paper ran a few short stories: carpenter missing in Milford, blood found at worksite. But the coverage faded as other news took over. Without new leads, the case began to slip from public attention. Inside the sheriff's office, the evidence board grew cluttered with photographs, timelines, and maps. Red string connected Victor's property to the barn site, then to Denton's land, then out to nowhere. Each path ended in silence. Hensley reviewed the statements over and over. Something was missing. A piece that would connect Victor's last known moment to the man everyone suspected but could not prove guilty. He sent soil samples, tire impressions, even the watch fragments to external labs, but none returned useful results. By the 3rd month, most of the deputies believed the case was over. Without a body, they could not prove homicide. Without clear evidence, they could not charge Denton. The sheriff's log entries became shorter. No new leads. Continuing background checks, winter arrived. Snow covered the fields where searchers once walked. The barn where Victor had vanished stood empty, the boards warping from the cold. Locals stopped talking about it as much. The mystery had turned into another small-town legend, the man who vanished from his own worksite. But for Tom Hensley, it did not fade. Every time he passed that road, he slowed his truck. Every night before leaving the office, he glanced at the case file stacked neatly on the corner of his desk. There was something unfinished about it, something that refused to let him rest. By spring of 1987, the sheriff had reopened the file 3 separate times, hoping for a new tip or confession. None came. The trail was gone, the leads cold, and the only constant remained a name written at the top of his suspect list, Harold Denton. As the months turned into years, others moved on. But Hensley could not, because somewhere beneath that barn floor, beneath the blood and the dust, he knew the truth was waiting, and one day, someone would find it. The days after Victor Lane's disappearance changed Milford County in quiet but lasting ways. The town was small, built on trust and routine, and his vanishing broke something that could not be easily repaired. Farmers began locking their barns at night. Dogs that once roamed freely were kept close to the porch. People who had known each other for decades now looked twice when a truck passed down the dirt roads after dark. At the diner, the same one where Victor drank his morning coffee, his absence was a constant reminder. His usual seat near the window stayed empty. The waitress still poured a 5th cup out of habit, then poured it away. No one talked about it much, but everyone thought about it. The sheriff's office received fewer calls as months went on, but the unease never left. Conversations about the case grew shorter, more careful. When Harold Denton's name came up, voices dropped to a whisper. Some believed he had done it. Others refused to say it aloud. In a town that valued peace, suspicion became a quiet companion. Victor's sister, Ruth Lane, lived a few miles outside town. She visited his workshop once a week, dusting the benches and wiping his tools, even though she never used them. She said she could not bear to see the place fall apart. The room smelled faintly of sawdust and oil, just as it had the day he disappeared. On the workbench, a small calendar still hung open to May 1986, the last month he was seen alive. Behind the sheriff's office, Victor's truck sat in the impound lot for years. The body rusted slowly under layers of dust and rain, its paint fading from red to dull brown. Locals would drive by and glance at it, as if the truck itself held an answer the police could not find. Every now and then, new rumors surfaced. Someone claimed to have seen a man who looked like Victor near the state line, or heard that he had run off to start over somewhere else. Sheriff Hensley followed up every lead, even when he knew it would lead nowhere. Each false sighting reopened the wound, then closed it again in silence. Church services were held in his memory, but the prayers never felt final. Without a body, there was no proof of death, only absence. And absence was harder to mourn. Over time, the town adjusted, though not in any comforting way. The barn where Victor vanished was eventually sold, then left to rot. Boards loosened, the roof sagged, and the weeds grew high around it. Children passed by on bicycles but never stopped. Parents warned them not to. By the 5th year, the case had become something people spoke of only when forced to remember. The file sat untouched in the sheriff's cabinet. Hensley still carried a copy in his drawer, though he no longer believed it would ever reopen. Life in Milford returned to its quiet rhythm. Crops were planted, fences repaired, festivals held. But beneath the routine, a dull unease lingered, a collective understanding that someone among them had gotten away with murder. Then, in the fall of 1991, the silence broke. 2 hunters, crossing a wooded ravine on the edge of county land, noticed something half-buried near the base of an old oak. It looked like torn fabric caught under the roots. When they pulled it free, the ground shifted, revealing what lay beneath, the first remains that would bring the case of Victor Lane back to life. It was late October 1991 when 2 hunters entered the thick woods east of Milford County, moving along a dry creek bed that had not carried water in months. The morning air was cold, the ground layered with brittle leaves. They were tracking deer when one of them noticed something strange beneath a fallen oak, a corner of what looked like old canvas jutting out of the soil. At first they thought it was trash. But when one man tugged on the edge of the fabric, the earth shifted, exposing a shape beneath it. A second pull tore the tarp open, and what emerged stopped them both in silence, the curve of a human skull, discolored and half-buried. The sheriff's department arrived within an hour. The area was sealed off, marked with tape, and officers worked carefully under the fading light. The tarp had long decayed, brittle and darkened by time. Inside were scattered remains, bones broken and displaced, a few scraps of clothing, and a rusted belt buckle that caught the edge of a deputy's flashlight. On the buckle were the faint initials VL. Nearby lay fragments of a red flannel shirt, the same kind Victor Lane had been wearing the day he disappeared. Within hours, the coroner confirmed what many already feared. The remains were human, and they had been there for years. The bones were transported to the state medical examiner's office for analysis. Under the sterile lights of the lab, the story began to take shape. The skull showed a single heavy fracture along the left side, blunt force trauma consistent with a strike from a solid object. The rest of the skeleton was largely intact, though weathered and incomplete. One arm bone bore an old, healed break, a match to the fracture Victor had suffered years earlier after a fall from a ladder. For Sheriff Tom Hensley, the confirmation was both a relief and a burden. After 5 years of uncertainty, he finally had proof that Victor Lane had been killed. But without new evidence, the case was still as fragile as the bones that now rested in front of him. The sheriff reopened the investigation, calling in retired deputies and former volunteers to re-examine the old files. They retraced the same steps, revisited the same questions, and returned to the same name, Harold Denton. When Hensley went to speak with Denton again, he found him unchanged. Denton greeted him at the door, older but steady, his expression unreadable. He denied everything. He said he had heard about the discovery on the radio and felt sorry for the family. He claimed he had no idea how the remains ended up near his property. Hensley searched Denton's land once more. This time, officers brought ground-penetrating tools, metal detectors, and shovels. They found nothing. No weapon, no trace of blood, no link that would stand in court. Denton's story remained consistent, and the sheriff's hands were tied. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as homicidal violence, blunt force, trauma. It confirmed what everyone already knew but proved nothing about who had done it. For a brief time, the county's attention returned to the case. Newspapers ran headlines calling it a breakthrough, a long-awaited answer. But as weeks turned to months, the interest faded once again. The investigation slowed, evidence went back into boxes, and the sheriff's logbook grew shorter with each entry. By the end of 1992, the remains of Victor Lane were placed in a wooden case inside the county archive, labeled and sealed. The sheriff attended the small memorial his sister Ruth arranged, quiet, simple, attended by only a few. The headstone read his name, his birth year, and a question that would remain unanswered. 1986. Tom Hensley left the service knowing the truth sat close but untouchable. The bones had spoken, but not loudly enough, and so they were boxed, stored, and left in the evidence room, waiting for a time when someone, somewhere, would open them again. Decades later, that moment would come, and with it, the silence that had haunted Milford County would begin to break. The years that followed the discovery of Victor Lane's remains were marked by slow frustration and fading memory. Through the 1990s, the investigation lived in fragments, brief surges of hope quickly swallowed by silence. Tips arrived in uneven waves. A farmer claimed he had seen a drifter near the old barn the night Victor disappeared. Deputies followed the lead for weeks, questioning travelers along back roads and checking motels. Nothing connected. Months later, a letter came from a prison inmate in Tennessee. He said another prisoner had confessed to killing a man named Victor during a robbery. Detectives drove across state lines, took statements, checked timelines. The man's story unraveled in hours. He had been hundreds of miles away that summer. The confession was a lie for reduced sentencing. Then came the most haunting rumor, a supposed sighting of Victor himself. A woman in eastern Kentucky reported a man who looked like him working construction under another name. Investigators followed the report, compared photos, and returned empty-handed. It was not Victor. It never was. By 1995, Sheriff Tom Hensley had spent nearly a decade with the case. The weight of it showed in every line of his face. He had grown older, slower, and quieter, the burden of unsolved crimes heavy in his final years of service. He sat in his small office one winter afternoon, flipping through the case file one last time. Photographs, soil reports, autopsy pages, all laid out across his desk like a map that led nowhere. There was no weapon, no witness, no confession. Just the lingering suspicion that Harold Denton knew more than he ever said. When Hensley retired in 1996, he carried Victor Lane's file to the evidence room himself. He wrote in the final line of the logbook, "Unresolved, homicide suspected." Then he closed the folder, placed it on the shelf, and locked the door. The case fell silent. As the years passed, time did what it always does. It erased. The barn was sold to another owner, its walls rebuilt and painted. The locals spoke of the murder less and less. Witnesses moved away or died. Those who remembered Victor did so quietly, in fragments. A man's laugh, his steady hands, his unfinished work. The evidence, sealed in boxes, began to decay. Labels faded, paper yellowed. The belt buckle rusted at the edges. The world moved forward, but Victor Lane's story remained frozen somewhere between memory and file number. For decades, it stayed that way, untouched, undisturbed, forgotten except by the few who had once searched for him, until 2023. That spring, the Kentucky Bureau of Investigation launched a statewide effort to reopen unsolved cases using new forensic methods. Dozens of cold files were pulled from archives, among them a weathered cardboard box from Milford County, marked Lane, Victor, 1986. When Detective Mara Collins lifted the lid and saw the faded photographs and evidence tags, she paused. The story she held in her hands had been waiting nearly 40 years for someone to look again. And this time, the evidence would finally begin to speak. Detective Mara Collins sat in the basement archive of the Kentucky State Police Headquarters, surrounded by boxes that carried the weight of unfinished stories. Each file was a name, a date, a silence left unresolved. She had joined the cold case unit to break that silence, and when she opened the box marked Lane, Victor, 1986, the dust lifted like breath after years of holding still. The folder inside was heavy, packed with yellowed reports, faded photographs, and brittle tape labels. A cracked Polaroid showed a barn half lit by sunset, the sheriff's tape cutting across the frame. Another photo captured Victor's pickup truck, engine off, door open, coffee cup balanced on the dash. It looked ordinary, but the emptiness around it carried the shadow of something final. Mara read through Sheriff Tom Hensley's notes line by line. His handwriting was neat but tense, every word pressed hard into the paper. She traced his questions, his theories, his frustrations. No body, suspicious neighbor, H. Denton, no witness, no resolution. Then came the follow-up reports from 1991, the discovery, the remains, the medical examiner's findings. She paused on the item list. One flannel fragment, dark red, possible blood trace. The notes showed it had been collected but never tested. In 1986, there had been no reliable way to analyze such a small sample. Now, things were different. Mara marked the item for priority reanalysis. Over the next week, she cataloged every piece of surviving evidence. The belt buckle, the broken watch, soil samples in glass jars, and the single bag marked cloth fragment, item 7A. She wore gloves, handling each object like it carried its own story. The case began to rebuild itself in her mind. Victor Lane, 38, carpenter, widowed, respected, no known enemies except a neighboring farmer named Harold Denton. The sheriff's reports described Denton as cooperative but guarded. Hensley's last interview summary ended with the words, "Cannot confirm alibi." Mara read that line several times. It stayed with her. In her office, she pinned the photographs to a corkboard in order, the The barn, the drag marks, the woods, the creek bed. The story unfolded like a quiet film, without motion, waiting for someone to hit play. She studied the terrain maps, traced the paths investigators had searched, and noted the distance from Denton's property line to the site where the remains had been found. Just under half a mile. The more she looked, the more one pattern returned. Everything that tied back to Denton had once been questioned but never proven. The old tests could not link him, but new technology might. She contacted the State Forensic Laboratory in Frankfurt and arranged for DNA analysis on all preserved samples, the bone scrapings, the flannel cloth, and a few small soil traces from the tarp. The scientists warned her that decades-old evidence often degraded beyond use. Still, she sent everything. The wait was long. Weeks passed as the lab processed the material. Mara filled the time by revisiting witness interviews and cross-referencing them with property records and old photographs. She found that Denton's land had been sold in 2002, the barn rebuilt, and his name barely mentioned since. Late one evening, as she sat in her office surrounded by files, she noticed something she had almost missed, a margin note in Hensley's handwriting beside the evidence list. It read, "Scrap of shirt, not Lane's size." That detail caught her attention. If the flannel piece did not belong to Victor, whose was it? She reopened the evidence photos and zoomed in. The torn edges of the fabric were darker, thicker, a different weave entirely. The realization hit quietly but firmly. That single overlooked detail might contain the truth everyone had missed. When the call finally came from the forensic lab, Mara's heart tightened. The technician spoke carefully, each word deliberate. The results were in. The blood on the flannel contained DNA from two individuals. One matched to Victor Lane, the other unidentified. Mara stared at the lab report in silence. For nearly 4 decades, the case had been defined by absence. No body, no suspect, no proof. Now, for the first time, the evidence spoke in 2 voices, and one of them did not belong to Victor Lane. In early 2024, the Kentucky State Police received the final report from the genetic genealogy team. The second DNA sample collected from Victor Lane's flannel fragment had been run through the National Database of Familial DNA. The results were startling. The DNA matched a living relative, a grandson of Harold Denton. Analysts traced the family tree, generation by generation, confirming what had been long suspected. The unidentified DNA belonged to Harold Denton himself. Denton had died in 2009, decades after Victor Lane disappeared, never questioned beyond his early interviews. For the small community of Milford County, the revelation was seismic. The man whose name had surfaced repeatedly during the first investigation, who had walked freely through the town, was now confirmed as the killer through science that had not existed in his lifetime. Years of speculation, rumor, and fear now had a factual foundation. Detective Mara Collins prepared her notes carefully before visiting Sheriff Tom Hensley. She found him at his home, frail but alert, a lifetime of law enforcement etched in the lines of his face. Hensley listened as Mara explained the results, laying out the genealogical pathway that linked Denton to the crime. She spoke clearly, without emotion, detailing the verification steps and corroborating evidence. Hensley's response was measured. He nodded slowly, staring at the floor for several moments. Then he lifted his eyes, meeting Mara's gaze without words. His silence carried the weight of decades of unresolved frustration. Years of unanswered questions, false leads, and quiet worry now culminated in this undeniable truth. The breakthrough rewrote the narrative of the Lane case. What had been a cold, unsolved disappearance became a confirmed homicide, solved through meticulous detective work and modern forensic science. The tools Hensley had once lacked, DNA, sequencing, genealogical databases, advanced lab techniques, had now completed the final pieces of the puzzle. Mara documented every detail: the sample collection, the chain of custody, the genealogy report, the cross-references with Denton's descendants. Everything was verified, leaving no room for doubt. Legal counsel began reviewing the findings to determine how the evidence could be presented publicly despite Denton's death. For the people of Milford County, The news rippled quietly at first. Those who had suspected Denton, those who had remained silent, now had confirmation. The relief was factual, not celebratory. The town had been living under the shadow of an unspoken truth for nearly 40 years, and that shadow was now gone. Yet Mara knew the discovery was only part of the story. DNA had confirmed the killer, but the motive remained unclear. Denton's grandson could provide some answers, but only fragments would surface. What had driven a man to kill a neighbor over something so seemingly small? Land disputes were common, but murder was rare. There had to be more. Hensley sat back in his chair, the room quiet around them. The barn, the drag marks, the blood, the broken watch, all of it came rushing back to him, decades compressed into this single revelation. Mara watched him, noting how the weight of history met the cold, factual closure of science. The confirmation was complete. Victor Lane's killer had been identified. The town could finally name the man who had haunted their memories for nearly 40 years. But the story was not finished. In reviewing Denton's personal records and financial history, investigators soon began to uncover that his motives extended beyond a simple land dispute. Hidden debts, secret transactions, and long-standing grudges suggested a deeper, darker rationale for Victor Lane's murder. Mara Collins made a note in her file. The DNA confirmed the killer. The next task would be to uncover why he had killed, and whether the truth would shock Milford County even more than the revelation of his identity. In the months following the DNA confirmation, investigators combed through archival records that had remained untouched for decades. County land deeds, old surveys, and bank transaction files provided a factual framework for Denton's motive. Victor Lane had been preparing to purchase a small parcel of land adjacent to his barn, less than 2 acres but strategically important for his ongoing carpentry projects. Documents showed a signed purchase agreement, notarized and dated 2 weeks before his disappearance. The records included Victor's check to the seller and acknowledgement by the county clerk. Harold Denton's name appeared repeatedly in the chain of property records. For years, he had claimed the same parcel as his own, citing vague historical boundaries and an old survey from the 1950s. Witness statements from neighbors, collected in the original investigation and reviewed decades later, confirmed that Denton had argued publicly about the property line. What had seemed a minor disagreement now revealed itself as a long-standing obsession. Bank ledgers from the 1980s showed that Denton had faced financial pressure at the time. A line item indicated a loan call on his property, alongside payments overdue to contractors for barn repairs. Analysts concluded that selling the disputed parcel or maintaining control over it had significant financial implications for him. Receipts and contracts obtained from local businesses reconstructed Denton's dealings with Victor. The carpenter had been hired to build fencing along adjacent plots, including the disputed parcel. Notes from hardware suppliers corroborated that Victor had been working toward finalizing the purchase, while simultaneously improving the land for his next project. Each document reinforced the pattern. Victor's acquisition threatened Denton's perceived ownership and financial stability. The property line dispute, long dismissed as a minor feud, had escalated in Denton's mind. The evidence suggested that when Victor approached completion of the sale, Denton acted decisively to prevent the transaction. Witness recollections from neighbors, previously overlooked, fit neatly into the emerging narrative. One recalled seeing Denton watching Victor at the barn more closely than usual in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Another remembered Denton commenting on Victor moving in on what was mine, words dismissed at the time as prideful exaggeration. The chain of events, reconstructed purely through documentation and verified accounts, showed a calculated response to a perceived threat. Denton's actions were deliberate, motivated by control over property and financial self-interest, not random anger or impulsive violence. With the motive now clearly defined, the investigation team began preparing a summary for public release. The documents, receipts, contracts, and verified witness accounts would form a factual, unemotional narrative, closing the chapter on speculation that had persisted for nearly 40 years. As the final records were organized and the report drafted, the county anticipated the official statement. Milford County, long haunted by absence and rumor, was on the verge of confronting the truth. The land dispute had ended in homicide, and the man responsible had been identified. The case that began with an abandoned truck and a missing carpenter was finally moving toward closure. After decades of silence, the community would soon hear the full story, grounded in evidence and finality. On a crisp morning in 2024, the Kentucky State Police held a press conference in Frankfort. Detective Mara Collins stood at the podium, surrounded by colleagues and a small contingent of local reporters. The announcement was concise and factual. The cold case of Victor Lane, missing since 1986, had been solved. DNA confirmed Harold Denton as the perpetrator, long deceased, and the motive tied to a disputed parcel of land. The news rippled through Milford County quietly at first. For a generation that had grown accustomed to rumor and absence, the confirmation felt unreal. Residents who had known both men nodded slowly, some shielding disbelief behind folded arms. Denton had been a presence in their lives for decades, a neighbor, a farmer, a man whose temper was known but never assumed lethal. In the days that followed, reporters visited the county, documenting the reaction of those who remained. Small gatherings formed at the local diner and post office, conversations measured and restrained. People spoke of Victor's work ethic, the barns and fences he had left behind, and the routine that had been broken by his disappearance. There was respect for the detective work and scientific rigor, tempered by the memory of years spent wondering, waiting, and hoping. Victor's family attended a small memorial at the county cemetery. Ruth Lane, his sister, oversaw the reburial of his remains. The coffin, weathered but cared for, was lowered into the ground beside a modest marker. Friends and distant neighbors watched silently, eyes fixed on the ceremony. No speeches were long or emotional, each movement deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of decades lost. Sheriff Tom Hensley, frail now but still steady, stood near the grave. When asked for a statement, he spoke slowly. "Justice has been delivered even if late," he said. His gaze lingered on the coffin. The words were simple, factual, and carried the weight of a lifetime spent chasing the truth. Around the county, life continued. The barns Victor had built remained in use. The roads he had driven were traveled by new generations. The old disputes, the rumors, and the fear faded into memory. Aging faces lined the benches of the church and the steps of the post office, reminders of time passing, of a community that had lived through uncertainty for nearly 40 years. For some, the case closure offered relief. For others, it reopened old questions about justice, human behavior, and what had been lost in the silence. But no amount of reflection could return the years or the life Victor had led. Detective Mara Collins filed the final report. Copies went to the state archive, the local sheriff's office, and the family. Evidence was catalogued, photographs labeled, and boxes sealed. The Lane case was officially closed, documented, verified, and stored. Yet in her office, Mara kept one copy of the entire file. It rested in her drawer, neatly stacked and marked. She did not need it for work, and no one expected it to be consulted again. But she kept it, a reminder that while the official story had ended, the human story behind it would never be entirely finished. The community had closure, the killer had been named, and the evidence told the final, indisputable story. Still, in quiet corners and behind locked doors, the memory of Victor Lane persisted. The barn, the truck, the sawdust, and the blood, they lingered as facts, reminders of a life interrupted and a truth uncovered decades later. As the sun set over Milford County, the story of Victor Lane was complete in the records, but not in the minds of those who had waited 40 years for answers. And for one detective, that story would never fully close. The barn stood still, decades older than the day Victor Lane had vanished. Its boards were weathered, nails rusted, and the roof sagged in places where rain had seeped through. The new owners had made no repairs, leaving it as it had been when the first officers arrived, a silent witness to a crime long hidden. Inside, the rafters stretched across the space, empty and unbroken. Dust settled in quiet layers, drifting in the shafts of light that passed through gaps in the walls. The floorboards creaked under careful steps, but no tool had moved. The hammer Victor had used, long gone, had been replaced by memory and record. Outside, the fields grew overgrown. Weeds tangled with remnants of old paths where searches had once scoured every corner. The creek that had run dry near the body site reflected the pale sky, calm and indifferent. It carried no trace of the struggle, only the slow erosion of decades. In the county archives, the Lane case rested in folders and boxes. DNA reports, photographs, land deeds, and Hensley's handwritten notes told the story of a man who vanished, a killer who went undetected, and a community suspended between fear and rumor. The evidence, now fully documented, provided closure, in fact, though memory carried the weight of uncertainty for years longer. Detective Mara Collins often returned to the file, not out of necessity, but from respect for persistence. Each document, each faded photograph represented a life interrupted, a mystery held in abeyance until science allowed the truth to emerge. In her office, the case remained a reminder that time could not erase facts, even if it buried them. For Milford County, the story had returned to silence. Residents moved on. The diner served coffee to new faces. The trucks rolled past the barn without pause. The church held service on Sundays, prayers no longer echoing over a vanished neighbor. But the presence of Victor Lane lingered in subtle ways, in the barn, in the fields, in the meticulous records left behind, the bones, the blood, the DNA they had spoken after nearly 40 years. Justice, delayed by decades, had finally been defined in laboratory reports, family trees, and archived documents. But the human cost, the quiet fear, and the lost years remained, impossible to quantify. The land itself bore witness. Fences shifted with storms. Roofs creaked. Doors banged in wind. Time passed relentlessly, indifferent to what had occurred beneath the rafters. Yet in that place, the traces of a life and a crime persisted. And so, the barn remained, empty, standing, weathered by years and silence. The wind moved through the rafters as it had on that last day Victor worked, carrying particles of dust, the remnants of sawdust, and the memory of a life interrupted. No triumph marked the conclusion, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. A small-town tragedy, paused for decades, solved by method, persistence, and the advances of science. The barn held the weight of absence, the county held the weight of years, and the files held the undeniable facts. The wind stirred once more. Dust drifted along the boards. The barn exhaled its history in silence. Time had revealed the truth, and at last the case rested. The weight of decades lifted but never forgotten.